I'll start. My name is Rod, and I like to party.
So you mean whiskey?
What?
You're saying it weird.
Saying what weird?
All of it.
Where do you get off?
Hey there, church planner. This is Robert Frazier. We are back for part 2 of our interview with Steve Pike. He's an incredible guy. Make sure to check out Next Wave and all that they're doing. This is part 2 from last week. And this week, you're going to hear him go into a bit more about what it means to be church planners that create multiplication, not just church planners that build ministries around themselves, which is a really important distinction for every church planter. When they start, the work is not to start a church. And actually, we probably even shouldn't call it church planting. What we want to see people who follow Jesus living on mission in new places and out of their lives as they share the gospel, as they teach people the way of Jesus. Communities of faith, churches emerge in those spaces. So hopefully you enjoy this week's interview with Steve, and make sure to be here next week. Tim Galley will be back with me, and be a good conversation. See you then.
So I really try to actually manage their expectations. I say things like, this might take you, 5 years from this point before you actually start to see anything happening. So it's not going to be 6 months. If it does happen in 6 to 12 months, that's great. I'm not against that, but let's just slow down and get everything in the right order, because really, again, the discovery phase is when they're just sort of sampling what's out there and increasing their knowledge and just enjoy it, because the next phase, and I know you said let's double click on
Oh, no, we're ready to move on.
discovery, but I want it, because I think this is where it really helps people when they realize what you need to do next is not just go dive bomb into the first community that you think. This is where discernment is. Okay, one of the things you want to discern is to where or to whom or to where and whom are you called? Like, who is God breaking your heart for? And again, this is so it's. I think that the transition between discover to deploy, discover to discern, is that you've arrived at a place where you are very sure, you feel this sense of calling, and now I want you to dig deeper and go, okay, what is that calling? Where's that calling focused? Is it a place? Is it a people? Is it both a place and a people? Because at the end of the day, starting a church is local. I mean, even if it's an online church, it's still local to there's a set of people. It's gamers, it's this, it's that, it's people who, work in the airline industry, whatever, they have a hard time connecting with a brick and mortar church in a geographic location. So, but it's still, it's local in the sense that the people are going to be, generally, it's really tough to have a church where you have 20 different languages spoken. I know people are trying to pull that off, but most of the time, same language. Most of the time, a similar kind of culture. And so, anyway, the point is, who's God breaking your heart for? Like, and another question that helps people get at that is, who's missing? Like, maybe the geography, but who in that geography is missing? Like, who are not being served by the church already? And just take your time to discern that. That's one thing you want to discern. The second thing you want to discern is, how are we going to be financially sustainable here? Because unfortunately, the big launch model has created this idea that you're supposed to, the way to start a church is to get together as much people who know how to give together, get a critical mass of those people together as fast as you can, and start holding services that are appealing to those people who are paying the tithes, and then start reaching the lost. Well, over and over again, what happens is that a bunch of Christians come together and have a great time and never get around to really reaching the lost, because the whole forming of that community is built around creating a great place for Christians to come together and worship Jesus, which is not a bad thing.
The form of the church itself was built for a different purpose. It wasn't built to be lost. Yeah.
Well, and here's the scariest part of that is the economic model actually de-incentivizes people from doing what they say they're going to do. You
Yep.
know, the reason nobody ever says, I'm going to start a church for Christians. They say, I'm going to start a church to reach lost people. But then the economic model that they're working with actually causes them to, if they have to decide, do I spend time with the Christian businessman or the atheist friend? It's going to be the Christian businessman in the early days because they need that guy's money, you know? And so, but if you have a way of being sustainable financially that is not dependent on the tithes and offerings, all of a sudden you're really set free to be involved in actual missional church planting, where you can spend time with the atheist instead of feeling like you have to chase down the businessman with the money. And the
Mhm.
cool thing about that is over time, that business person may very well become involved in the church, um, but they're coming to a church that's already formatted around the right reason for the
Mhm.
church to exist, but which is to be on mission with Jesus, to seek and save that which is lost.
Well,
And so that's really, in fact, with urban churches specifically, I say, I won't even have another conversation with you until you bring me a 5-year business plan that shows how you're going to be financially sustainable for the next 5 years. And they say, well, how am I going to do it? I said, figure it out.
yeah.
But you got to do the research. If you can't at least come back and say, okay, we're going to, help, we're going to do this and do that. I'm going to get a side hustle, blah, 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 whatever. And then we can evaluate, is this realistic, and help the person wrestle with all that stuff. And then it might be time for them to actually activate in the community. But until they have a financial strategy, the bottom line is it's like when the when the oxygen mask, they say, when the in the plane, when the oxygen mask drops, put it on yourself first before you put it on your kid, because if you pass out, you're not going to be able to get it on your kid. And so, and this is the same thing. The church is definitely not going to be there unless you are there. And so you've got to figure out a way. And so it's really a surprise to people. Now that doesn't mean that you're not doing other things like beginning to pray for the community, people in the community, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the financial piece, and God will help people figure it out. Yeah, I
And
know you're like Exhibit A, Robert.
yeah, well, what I ask church planners when they come to our town is, are you committed to our city, or are you here to plant a church? And if it doesn't work out, you're going to leave.
Right.
And for
Yeah.
them, they always say, "Oh, I'm here for the city." But what we
Right.
see is that those who are disappointed by the how large the church becomes, or how self-sustaining it is, or the financial pressure, that's when you find out, are they really here long term? And I'll
Right.
sit down, I'll say, listen, if the church can't support you fully in 3 years, which is
Right.
a 50-50, like best case
Yeah.
scenario, 50-50, is this thing going to be
Yeah.
able to pay you enough to live off of?
Yeah.
Are you still committed to making disciples for the rest of your life where God has
Yeah.
planted you? And are you willing to do what it takes financially to do that? And most of
Yeah.
them, the answer is no. Like,
Right.
fundamentally, they're going to leave the ministry before they find a way to stay
Right.
engaged.
Well,
And
that's exactly why I asked them that. It's a very sort of unspiritual sounding kind of question. It's like, what's your business plan for the next 5 years? And if that turns them off, if they're not willing to think that out, because one of the things, interesting thing that I learned from Tim Keller's group, City to City, is they've noticed that when people move into a new community from outside that community, if it's very common for many of them to give up about 4 to 5 years into it. They don't even count a church as established until that church has been around for 7 years, because of exactly what you're talking about. People come in with these visions of grandeur, and it doesn't work out. I'm not making this up. I had a guy call me one time. He said, "Hey, I'm just calling you to let you know we're shutting the church down." And I said, "What do you mean you're shutting the church down? I need more information." He said, "Well," he said, "we're only running about 150 people." And I said,
only
what are you
150,
talking?
that's larger than
Only,
10% of
yeah.
the churches in America.
He said, well, our ministry plan was that by now we'd be running 500, and since we're not, we're failing, so we're just gonna shut it down. I mean, it's that kind of stupid thinking. Well, stupid, whatever, just short-sighted thinking. There's too much of that going on. So
Yeah.
helping people, establish themselves, and I think you're right. Like, letting people know, man, if this is about making disciples. If you're not willing to come here and make disciples over the long haul, then don't even start. And most people, again, I won't have a second conversation if they're not willing to do the 5-year plan. And most of them aren't. They want,
Yeah.
oh no, I know I'm going to go, advertise. We're going to do mailers to
These
25,000
marketing
people and
area.
all this stuff. Yeah.
And what we're finding is that when these parachute church planters come in, we love them. We care about them deeply. We want to see them successful, and we're pretty invested in them building these communities that will have long-term impact in our city because we love our city. And a lot of
Right.
times what happens is the problem is there's this ripcord that they can pull and go back home
Right.
and go to
Right.
safety. And a lot of times
Right.
it's when they're in the valley of the shadow of death and they're struggling and they need the formation of that moment. But the problem is there's
Yeah.
this temptation to say, I'm going to run back home and I'm going to
Right.
take a job at the church or whatever that temptation is to go back to the workforce. And
Yeah.
they thought that they were creating for themselves a position of authority that would pay their bills and that would give them a
Right.
job rather than I'm called to spiritually shape a community and partner with God and his work in the world. And so for me, it's like really shifting their mindsets from pastor to missionary is what we're talking
Yeah.
about, because pastors who plant churches are
Yeah.
pastors who are looking for jobs
Yeah.
as shepherds rather than
Right.
missionaries who are
Yeah.
looking to reach the lost.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's why this discernment phase is like so important, is before you start, hit the button and move into the community. The other thing that somebody needs to do during the discernment phase is really map out their transition from where
Mhm.
they're at to where they're going to be. Like again, some people just don't give thought. Like if you're on a staff of a church or if you have a job or whatever, you just don't march in the office and say, "Okay, I'm gone," and just you want to leave well, and you also want to give yourself, be thoughtful about, okay, we're going to go from here where we kind of know how it works, and we're stepping into this unknown, and make that as tangible as you can. Well, that doesn't happen by accident, and so that's another piece of the discernment phase: is how are we going to make the transition in a way that honors where we're coming from and helps us to arrive where we're going in a way that is healthy and honoring there. Which then that's the deploy phase. So once you've mapped out then you're deploying into the place, or you're activating. If you already live there, sometimes you just activate where you're already at. You change, okay, I'm going to start making disciples or whatever, and that's what during the deploy phase is actually what you do. I always say, we ask the wrong question. The question is not how do we start a church. The question is how do we start making disciples. That's the question.
Yep.
If you do that, the church will emerge. But
Yeah.
if you start with the idea that we're here to start a church, then your focus is on the institutional elements, and you're measuring what you're doing by how many people are showing up to your
Mhm.
gatherings and stuff like that, instead of, wait, we're here to make disciples. How are we doing at that? And you can do that immediately. You don't have to wait for some date out into the future where the church is launched. No, the church, as soon as you activate in the community, the church is there. You're the church, and you start making disciples, and that gradually becomes a worshiping community. And at some point, you can say, okay, now we're going to gather everybody together and go public. But one of the words that I've kind of moved away from, launch is a word, but I like to talk about emerging, the church emerging in a community. And that doesn't always have a launch date attached to it. There are some firsts along the way that can be celebrated, but I think we've given way too much attention to this, the public gathering. It says something about what's important to the church, instead of celebrating disciple making and enjoying the journey as we go.
Well,
And
and
so
do we
that's
ask
part of
that
the deploy.
question? Do we ask that question enough during our assessment phase with planners? Do we say, "I'd like you to show me somebody that you saw them come to faith, and then show
Yeah,
them how to follow God, and then they are
right.
participating in a disciple
Yeah.
making community"? Because I think
If
that
it's a good if it's a good assessment process, we are asking that question. Yeah.
yeah, I don't think we ask it early enough in the process, because if they're in an assessment, that there's an assumption that they're going to be at least on the pathway to planting
Yeah.
some sort of community. But too often we don't ask, well, have you learned to make a disciple? And if you haven't learned to
Right.
make a disciple, that's it. Like that's all you need to learn right now is how to make a
Right.
disciple. And you need to be in a community that's showing you how to multiply disciples. And then the church is a natural byproduct of the work rather than
Yeah.
this special, we've specialized it into this, mechanism. This is Americans are really good at creating, technical efficiency at the wrong things. Like
Yes.
we're
Yeah.
really good at doing things well that don't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I guess I do want to say that um, I think like I don't know you super well, but I know enough about you personally that you're kind of wired to be somebody who's maybe more comfortable than most people starting with a blank slate and just going for it. And I'm kind of wired that way too. So I kind of understand, like, to me, I prefer I don't want any instructions. I just want to,
Yeah.
give me the place and go
Self
after it.
spirit.
I
Yeah.
I do realize that not everybody's wired that way, and just because they're not wired that way doesn't mean they cannot be planters. But what we just talked about, if you can't make a disciple, now I think there are some, I think you and I talked about like dinner church with Verlin Fosner
Mhm.
as that's a way of doing church that's very outside of the norm. It's certainly not the big lunch model and stuff like that. So one of the things I try to do sometimes with planners during that deployment phase and maybe the discernment, it's probably back in the discernment. I say, let's think about, is there a way of being the church that really resonates with you and based on what you know right now can resonate in this community, but let's not lock into it until we move into the community. And and I think it's good for many people do benefit from sort of a framework they can go, okay, we don't have to reinvent the wheel for some stuff.
Yeah.
And I think they're legit, and I think that's probably the majority of people that are going to do church planning successfully will fit into that realm where they need a little bit of framework and guideline. But to me, it still goes back to their calling and their understanding that we're here to make disciples, and part of the problem is we all haven't been raised in that kind of environment.
If you grow up
Um,
in a church that says we disciple through the teaching on Sunday morning rather than through
yeah,
formation of community, then they're like, well, I'm making disciples by starting a congregation where people will sit and listen to me preach. Like that's the shift
exactly,
discipleship
E-
mentality they need.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's why we really, I advocate in Next Wave that we need to really rediscover or reimagine discipleship
Mhm.
because we've really truncated it and over. Well, I don't know I don't know if it's too simple or not simple enough. What we've done with it, but yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. Well said. So then deploy is really starting a community of disciples in that neighborhood or in that community that eventually starts to develop some community habits, and that's when we move to the develop phase. And
Mhm.
that might be the launch, or it might be the point where they emerge as a church that has a sort of collective identity in the community, and you want to do that well too. I mean, organisms are organized. It's chaos is not. You can't have uh, forward progress where everything is just completely laissez-faire and there's no direction. And so there does need to be a development thing. And then the final thing is duplication, which is repeat.
Mhm.
So that's what those 5 phases are. And I do orient new church planners to thinking about that because they can see that it makes the journey. It's not just move into the community, start the church 6 months later, and by that meaning, holding worship services. There's a lot more going on, and we try to push them towards a more mission-oriented mindset versus a pastor-oriented mindset. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so we need to hang out more, Steve. That's all I'm realizing after this conversation. We've got a few minutes left. I want to dive in before we go today. What you've been a key part of seeing multiplication happen, starting
Yeah.
with your church in Utah, planting 5 churches, and then
Yeah.
helping the church multiplication network grow through the Assemblies of God, and you've seen a lot. So I'd love to start with where where does a leader start to think about multiplication, and how does that shift happen in a leader's mind from I'm leading a church that is demanding of me to I have some other calling beyond that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have the definitive answer to that question, but I think some things that will help a leader get to that place in their mind is first of all changing the metric, like from how many people sit there and hear me on Sunday morning. That's become the metric that everybody decides whether or not what they're doing is significant or not. To how many people have we been able to send out into mission, whether it be full-time missionary work in another land, other church plants, or just activating people as disciples in their daily lives? That's a much more important number than how many people show up to hear you speak on Sunday. So I think when a pastor starts to realize when if they can make that internal shift from being obsessed with how many people came on Sunday to kind of being obsessed with how many disciple makers and you know catalysts, missional catalysts are being um, developed and sent out from their church. That's the seed, that's the foundation of a multiplication movement, is that mentality, like an obsession with that's what we want to see.
Yeah.
Which what kind of goes hand in hand with that, the thing that I've noticed about churches that actually become multiplication movements, or even just are able to actually plant other churches, um, is that they have some kind of intentionality in developing leaders. So
Mm.
again, that's the the person sitting in the the ultimate whatever, the pastoral, the lead pastor, I guess we call him nowadays. That person needs to come to the place where they're committed to developing all the leaders around them, and not just talking about leadership, but actually creating ways. So I'll just give you a quick example. I had a guy that called me up after I'd started this church in Utah, and he goes, "Hey, I want to come out, and I feel like I'm called to plant a church. What should I do?" And I said, "Well, why don't you come join our staff for a little bit, and we'll figure it out." So I prayed about, like, how do I help this guy? And the Lord spoke to me, and there was a campus in that town that was a secular university campus, had like 30,000 students that were mostly commuters. So it was a weird campus because it wasn't mostly residential. But anyway, nobody had ever been able to successfully start a Christian ministry on that campus. So I said to this church planner, this prospective church planner, I said, "Here's what I want you to do: start a Christian campus ministry on this campus, and if you do that well and successfully, then we'll send you out to plant a church." And I honestly, I told him, I said, "Nobody else has done it. You might fail. So my expectations are really low, and let's just enjoy the journey, and I'll coach you as you go." Well, a year later, he had this campus ministry that was blowing up. They had all these adult leaders as he trained and developed. I'm like, oh my goodness, this guy can do it. So leadership training is hands-on. Like, I mean, sure you need to do a little bit of didactic stuff, but figure out a way to quickly get people's hands in the clay of whatever it is, and develop them. And so anyway, have intentionality in that. So like I started this thing called the Men of Issachar, and we'd get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and we'd do push-ups and whatever, and it was these guys that I saw potential in. I'm invite them into the Men of Issachar, and from there, that's where we started identifying people, and we'd say, okay, let's do this and do that. So the thing is, that doesn't happen by accident. Is what I'm trying to say. There's got to be intentionality in leadership development, and it's way easier to find that and do that in a church where it's built on a platform of disciple making, because the very concept of disciple making is individuals activating in their own lives, consciously thinking about, I'm making disciples of the people around me. When people think that way, then it's really not much of a step to say, okay, now let's not only develop your disciple making abilities, but your leadership abilities. And once you start developing leaders, then you're going to end up potentially, you don't worry about, oh no, Billy Bob's going out to start a new church, we're going to lose. You don't think of that as a loss anymore. Billy Bob's position is going to be filled by somebody else who may also
Yeah.
be sent out. And so you're never at a loss for leaders if you have a leadership development climate or intentionality in the church. Yeah.
Yeah, we had Dave Ferguson on a couple weeks ago on the podcast, and
Yeah.
his line is always, "My fruit grows on someone else's tree," and once you realize that it's not about me, it's about the kingdom, and the kingdom has this
Yeah.
like cascade of fruit that happens through multiplication. All of a sudden, it's not about me building an organization; it's about what's going to happen. And with our local network, we started to talk about church planting and multiplication.
Yep.
We planted a bunch of XPs and associate pastors who were kind of ready.
Yeah.
And then we looked around and we're like, who else is there? And
Yeah.
that led us to say, okay, now we can start talking about leadership development. And then we started talking about leadership development and realized, you know what? We don't have a leadership pipeline because we haven't been
Yep.
making disciples. And so we're getting back to the basics by once you
Right.
focus on, okay, if we're going to plant 100 churches, how we're going to get there, you work your way back to it's the nuts and bolts, it's the blocking
Yeah.
and tackling of, can I make disciples who make disciples?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's
And
the
it's way
movemental
harder.
work that
It's
we're
way harder to
called
do
into.
than to say,
Yeah.
but it can be done. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know you've got to go, so I want to say thank you so much for being here. We need to have another conversation
Yeah.
about urban church planning, about what you're doing with Next Wave. So we'll have you on again, and I want to give a quick shout out to Dan Sirdal for
Well,
connecting
and
us
we're
up, because
trading
it's
places
been a
next
joy
week,
the times we've got
except
together,
I'm not
man.
going to be there. Dan's actually going to be interviewing you next week because you're going to be on the Next Wave Community Meetup. So thanks for agreeing to do that. And heads up, Dan will be doing it.
Yeah,
I'm tied up at a conference that I
absolutely.
haven't figured out that cool trick of being two places at the same time yet. It just hasn't. I haven't figured it out. But
Well, I'd love for you to,
yeah,
real quick before you go,
yeah,
just share with
sure.
people how they can connect with you and
My
hear more about
email
what you're
address
doing.
is Steve at I've got several different ones. I was thinking, which one am I? Yeah, Steve at nextwave.community. Steve, Steve, at nextwave.community. You can also find out about more about Next Wave Community at nextwave.community. So that's all you have to remember is nextwave.community. The email address is just Steve at on the front of that, and then, but you can also look at the website through nextwave.community. That's how you get in touch with me.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much
Love
for
it,
making some
love it,
time,
Robert.
and we'll get you
Glad
on
we're on
again
the
to
same
talk
team,
some
man.
more. All right. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for joining us at the Church Planter Podcast. Remember, if you want to reach the people that no one's reaching, you got to go where no one's going and do what no one else is doing. See you next week. We got Peyton and Pete on Monday morning, and we'll be here on Wednesday.